She was born into a world of silence before the storm, a cradle swaying in the breathless calm. Between generations of conquest, the ground beneath her would one day tremble with the thunder of hoofbeats and the iron grip of empire. But in those early days, her name was only a whisper carried on the wind across the steppes. In the shadow of the Mongol Empire, where empires bowed or burned, a woman rose not with gentle hands, but with fists wrapped in calluses and a gaze as sharp as any general's sword. Her world was one where kings rode behind their sisters and warlords listened when their daughters spoke, but even in that rare pocket of respect, power still wore a man's skin. Yet she refused the role written for her in the blood-soaked scrolls of tradition. As brothers schemed and emperors grew fat on tribute, she trained alone under a burning sky. Her arrows splitting reeds midair, her wrestled enemies tasting dirt. The empire would come to know her not as a queen or wife, but as a threat, a rift in the foundation of a dominion that claimed it could not be broken. She was the fracture that dared to spread. But before we descend into her world, before we ride beside her in the dust and the blood, let us ask something deeper. What does it mean to stand against an empire? Not with armies or nations, but with the weight of your own being. This is Candle and Coffin. Let's uncover the forgotten truth beneath the ashes of history. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far this story travels. She was not born in a palace, nor did she inherit silk or scripture. Her inheritance was a saddle, a bow, and a legacy soaked in blood. Her ancestors had carved their empire not with laws but with fire. Their victory stitched across Asia in the language of siege and submission. The name they bore, Borjigan, was a name that turned thrones to dust and thrones to ash. She, too, carried the blood, but unlike her male kin, who measured greatness in cities raised or vassals bent, she measured strength and control and discipline, and how one bore the silence between storms. Her name was Khutulun, the only daughter of Kaidu Khan, great-grandson of Ogadai. She was forged not in courtly luxury but in the harsh crucible of Central Asia, where the wind peeled skin and horses were dearer than gold. From a young age, Khutulun stood apart, as her cousins practiced politics and her brothers wrestled for crumbs of favor. She trained beneath the cold stars, each night driving arrows into straw effigies meant to mimic invading armies. By 12, she rode faster than most men. By 15, she could wrestle them into the dust. And yet, what made her terrifying was not her strength but her mind. She understood something her enemies did not, that to defy an empire, one must first make the story that holds it together. And the Mongol story, their myth of conquest, their unyielding male code was brittle at its core. Khutulun's mere existence, proud and unyielding, struck at that core. She did not need rebellion. She was rebellion, dressed in leather and mounted on a war horse. But her father's enemies were circling. The empire was split, fractured by rival claimants and agingkins, their glory days rotting from within. In this chaos, Kaidu leaned on his daughter not just as a warrior, but as a symbol. If Khutulun could hold the line, the old ways might yet survive. But to do so, she would have to fight not only armies, but culture, court, and kin. Because the greatest battle she would ever face was within the empire itself, across the steppes. Songs still echo of the girl who would not yield. They speak of her as half myth, half warrior, a figure to fierce for the bards to tame and to reel for the scribes to ignore. But beneath the legend lay a girl molded by pressure, not privilege. Khutulun grew up at the flank of her father, Kaidu Khan, the last great holdout of the House of Ogadai, whose power stretched from the Altai Mountains to the Amu Darya. Kaidu was not just her father, he was the final flame of a dynasty under siege. The Yuan emperors in the east, descendants of Kublai Khan, claimed divine mandate from Beijing's palaces. The Ilkhanate in Persia bowed to Islam and silks, and yet Kaidu, with his daughter by his side, clung to the older code, the raw, untamed spirit of the steppe. Genghis Khan's spirit still rode with them in the wind, but it was flickering. That spirit demanded loyalty, clarity, war, and Khutulun became its fiercest vessel. While her brothers jostled for favor, Khutulun rode into campaigns as her fathers. Shadow and shield. When Kaidu faced betrayal by allies who bowed to yuan gold, it was she who charged first, not as a daughter seeking approval, but as a general. She was the tip of his sword and the iron in his will, and with every victory, her legend grew. The woman who never lost a wrestling match, the warrior who demanded any man seeking her hand must first defeat her in combat, and none did. 40, some say, even 100 men tried. All failed, not because they were weak, but because she had no intention of surrendering herself as a prize. Marriage, in the court of Kaidu, was often a transaction, but Khutulun would not be sold. Every time a suitor kissed the dust at her feet, it was not just his pride that shattered, it was the Empire's assumption of what a woman must be. And yet, the walls were closing. Kublai Khan's influence was creeping westward, poisoning loyalties and corrupting bloodlines. Kaidu, aging and stubborn, needed Khutulun more than ever, and in the shadows of the steppes, voices began to whisper that her strength might one day outshine her brothers, and perhaps even him. It was in the dying light of an empire's pride that Khutulun's power reached its peak and its most dangerous edge. By her 20s, she had become more than a commander. She was a presence that unsettled the very rhythm of the Mongol world. Men in Kaidu's court would rise when she entered, not out of courtesy, but because something in their bones told them to, as if she carried with her the old gods of the steppe, fierce and watching. She rode at the head of her father's armies, not at his side, and when Kaidu grew ill, many whispered that she was already leading in truth. Yet in the fractured politics of the post-Genghis Mongol Khanates, power was not worn, it was hunted, and Khutulun, in the eyes of many, had begun to look like prey that had grown too strong. Her brothers resented her not because she was unworthy, but because she shattered their mirrors. In her, they saw what they could never be. Their horses were swift, but hers was faster. Their blades were sharp, but hers struck first. But it was her mind, above all, that terrified them. Khutulun understood alliances. She read maps not as borders, but as veins of blood flowing through the Empire's weakening heart. She saw where Kublai's whispers had taken root, where loyalties were softening, and she warned Kaidu. The enemy was not just across the mountains, it was within their own tents. But Kaidu, though proud of her, had grown weary. The years of fighting his cousin Kublai, the endless backroom betrayals, the thinning loyalty among his nobles, it had aged him. In moments of weakness, he too fell into the old belief that rule must pass to his son, and so began the slow corrosion of Khutulun's position. First came the silence as meetings held without her. Then came the suitors, men not seeking her hand, but her removal. Offers came from powerful allies, marry her and bring her under control. One even proposed a double benefit marriage to her, an alliance with Kublai's court. Kaidu rejected them, but the fact they dared ask showed the change. Khutulun's power was no longer a symbol, it was a threat, and the empire, already cracking beneath its own weight, could not bear a woman at the helm no matter how much blood she had shed in its name. Winter crept across the steppes like a silent siege, frosting the grasses and silencing even the bravest of horses. It was in such stillness that betrayals took root, not in the clash of swords, but in the silence between them. Khutulun had grown accustomed to the cold. She thrived in it. Her fingers, callous from bowstring and frost, moved with precision. Her eyes scanned the horizon not for enemies, but for shifts in the wind, the kind of shifts that foretold disaster. Before the first banner was even raised, she sensed something breaking. It was not just the Empire, it was her father. Kaidu, once iron-willed and unbending, began to falter. His voice shook when he gave commands. His hands trembled when he signed edicts. And with every sign of weakness, the wolves circled Khutulun, alone among her siblings, understood the stakes. The empire was a wounded beast, and the Yuan court under Kublai Khan would not wait long to strike. Already, defections had begun. Clans that once owed loyalty to Kaidu now whispered of peace with Beijing. And within Kaidu's own household, her brothers conspired. Men who had never led troops into battle, who wore fine robes while she wore armor still caked with blood. One in particular, Oris, had begun gathering support. He was younger, charismatic, and most dangerously, willing to promise whatever the nobles wanted. He swore fealty to tradition, even as he hollowed it out, and Kaidu, desperate for unity, began to lean on him. Khutulun watched in silence as her father, the man who had once declared her his right arm in battle, began to turn to others for counsel. Not because she had failed him, but because she reminded him of what he could never become again. Strong, defiant, unbent. Still, she remained loyal. She advised with clarity, fought with fury, and led her units with unmatched discipline. But every victory she brought was now met with silence. No feasts were held in her honor. No songs were sung. Her legend had grown too large, and the court had begun the work of shrinking it. Rumors spread that she used witchcraft, that her victories were rigged, that no woman could defeat so many men without trickery, lies, but potent ones. Because in empires built on fear, truth mattered less than what men were willing to believe. And Khutulun, for all her brilliance, could not wrestle shadows into submission. The rod of empire is rarely loud. It doesn't arrive with drums or fire. It seeps in quiet, patient, disguised as reason. In the twilight of Kaidu's reign, the empire he fought to preserve had become a mirror of what it once defied. The very core that had stood for the purity of the steppe, mobility, merit. Tradition now whispered of silk-lined diplomacy and marriage alliances with former enemies. It was in this haze of fading glory that the question began to surface, first in corners, then in councils. Who would succeed the Khan? Not a single name emerged from every mouth. And that silence was telling. Kaidu had many sons, but none bore the scars of battle, the confidence of command, the trust of the men. Only one figure loomed over them all, not in silk, but in armor, not in softness, but in will. Khutulun. Her warriors called her their general. Her enemies cursed her name with respect. And Kaidu, somewhere deep beneath the weariness, knew she was his truest heir. But history is not written by the worthy. It is shaped by the comfortable. And Khutulun, too many, was simply too sharp. Her rule would be hard, uncompromising, stripped of indulgence. She could not be molded into marriage, nor bribed into submission. She was not a vessel for alliances. She was a blade that carved through them. So the court did what courts always do when faced with dangerous virtue. They whispered. They said she craved power too much. They said she was unnatural, a woman in a man's world, acting beyond her station. And most damningly, they said she had betrayed Kaidu's trust, siphoning loyalty from the army to carve a throne for herself. Lies, every word of it, but lies whispered in proximity to a dying man. Kaidu, torn between love and fear, began to withdraw. His words to Khutulun grew clipped. His orders came secondhand. Still, she did not flinch. She continued to lead his armies, continued to patrol the empire's western flank, where Yuan influence crept like mold through the mountains. But her isolation deepened. Her brothers, sensing her fall, closed ranks. Oris, the smiling pretender, began to gather men around him who had once pledged loyalty to her. They promised him the khanship if he would promise them comfort, soft beds, golden treaties, peace at the cost of honor. And when Kaidu finally summoned his court for the decision that would name his successor, Khutulun stood alone, flanked not by allies, but by enemies in her own blood. The council tent was a furnace of silence. The air inside seemed thick with unspoken debts and ancestral ghosts, watching from the embroidered walls, their eyes stitched in gold and judgment. Kaidu sat at the center, old now, bent not just with age, but with the weight of a fractured empire. Around him, the nobles of the steppes gathered, men who had once ridden to war with him, now gray and weary, others younger, softer, their armor polished but untested, and among them, Khutulun stood alone, towering without needing to raise her voice. She did not dress in court silks. Her leather tunic bore the dust of the frontier. Her shoulders carried the scent of horse sweat and fire. She made no speeches. She didn't need to. Her victories lived in the memories of the very men now pretending to forget them. Horus spoke first, of unity, of alliances, of restoring peace through diplomacy, the kind that stinks of velvet and betrayal. His voice was calm, measured, full of the words cowards use when they want to pass as wise. He did not mention Khutulun by name, but every word was aimed like a dagger. We need continuity, harmony, the kind of leadership that listens, not one that dominates. Some nodded, some did not. Kaidu said nothing. When Khutulun finally spoke, it was not to plead, it was to remind. She recited battles, Aksu, where she led the flank that shattered the Yuan ambush, Tashkent, where her charge turned retreat into victory, the siege of Bak, where she negotiated the surrender of a fortress without shedding a single drop of blood. She named the soldiers who died under her command. She named the villages still loyal to her banner. She did not ask to lead, she showed that she already had. But truth has no crown in a room ruled by fear, and fear, that old political currency, changed the course of history that day. Kaidu hesitated. He looked at her long, hollow, broken, a father lost in the chasm between legacy and illusion, and then, with a voice cracked by hesitation, he declared Horus's heir. The silence that followed was not relief. It was dread. Even Horus looked unsure, for in that moment, the Empire learned something fatal, that fear had won, and that it had silenced its strongest protector. Khutulun did not protest. She bowed once, low and deliberate, her eyes locked on Kaidu's until. He flinched. Then she turned, stepped into the wind, and vanished into the night, not as a daughter dismissed, but as a lioness uncaged. The wind tore through the steppes that night like a cry of warning sharp. Cold, unrelenting, Khutulun rode alone beneath the stars, her cloak flaring behind her like a banner of exile. She did not weep. She had no use for the softness of grief. What had been taken from her was not a title, it was trust. The empire she bled for had chosen comfort over clarity, and, in doing so, it had sealed its own fracture. Yet Khutulun was no longer bound to its dying rhythms. If they would not give her command, she would lead in truth, if not in name. Her warriors, the ones who had followed her not for bloodline, but for merit, remained loyal. And loyalty, she knew, was the last currency that mattered in a crumbling world. She withdrew west, toward the fringes of Kaidu's realm, where borders blurred and Yuan agents crept in like shadows. There, she built a bastion not of walls, but of movement. Her troops were lightning, mounted, mobile, lethal. They patrolled the Silk Road routes with discipline that rivaled any standing army. Caravan raiders were hunted down, Yuan messengers intercepted, and rival tribes warned this region belonged to her. It was not rebellion, it was preservation. While Horus spent his days in council, trying to herd nobles with promises and parades, Khutulun secured the Empire's arteries, the trade routes, the mountain passes, the grain shipments, and the people saw. They remembered in the villages of Fergana and Samarkand. Mothers taught their daughters her name. Soldiers drank to her at night, even those who now served under her brothers. And the whispers began again, but different now, less political, more mythic. The woman who should have ruled, the daughter who defends while her father sleeps. The Khan of no crown, but myths invite danger, the Yuan court, hearing rumors of Khutulun's resurgence, began to move against her. Spies infiltrated her ranks. Messengers arrived with veiled threats, offers of amnesty if she would lay down arms, return to the capital, marry into peace. She burned the letters without reply, Every attack only clarified her purpose. The Empire may have denied her the throne, but it could not erase her from the map, and as snow began to fall again on the mountains of the east, Khutulun prepared for what she knew would come next. Horus was faltering, Kaidu was dying, and soon, the very men who had cast her out would beg her to save what little remained. The winter of Kaidu's final year fell heavy, like a judgment. Snow cloaked the steppes in silence, and with it came the slow disintegration of what had once been the greatest resistance to Yuan dominion. In the capital, Horus floundered beneath the weight of a crown he had not earned. The nobles who had once backed him grew restless, their gold spent, their influence shriveling with every lost trade deal and shifting border. Reports from the west troubled them. Khutulun's patrols were still intact, her command unquestioned, her border secured while theirs dissolved into uncertainty. In whispered corners of Kaidu's court, old voices returned to her name. She had not claimed the throne, and yet she acted like a sovereign. She governed without sitting on the throne. She commanded without ceremony. Even dying, Kaidu heard the rumblings not from advisors, but from soldiers, merchants, riders returning from the outer provinces. They spoke of Khutulun not as a ghost or rebel, but as hope. It sickened Horus. He tightened his control, exiled suspected sympathizers, and issued decrees meant to cut her off from supplies and reinforcements. But empires do not collapse from the outside. They rot from within, and every action Horus took to weaken her only made his own position more brittle. The people saw the contrast. Where he offered words, she offered food. Where he drafted policies, she rode with her troops in snowstorms, defending caravans herself, sharing their campfires. In a world raised on the legacy of Genghis Khan, that kind of leadership still meant something. Meanwhile, Kaidu's health had begun its final descent. Bedridden, fevered, he drifted between lucidity and silence. His empire governed now by ambition rather than wisdom, and in one lucid moment, when summoned by what few loyalists remained in the capital, Khutulun returned, not in force but alone. She entered her father's yurt not as a warrior, but as a daughter, and Kaidu, thin as a reed and barely able to speak, looked upon her and wept, not for himself, not for the empire, but because he finally saw what he had done in denying her. He had doomed the house of Ogadai. He tried to speak to name her his successor, to undo the error, but his voice failed him. And then, before the dawn, so did his breath. Kaidu Khan, last great pillar of Mongol independence, died with regret etched into his silence. The Khanship passed not by merit, but by inheritance. But the people knew. When news of his death spread, it was not Horus they mourned with, nor did they wait for edicts from the capital. It was Khutulun's campfires they lit in mourning. It was to her that riders looked for orders, and it was her banner, dark blue, against the snow, that flew above the tomb of the fallen Khan. The death of Kaidu was both an end and a beginning of moment, when the fragile threads holding the empire together snapped, with a violence that echoed across the steppes. Horus, now calm by right of blood, but not by the consent of the people, attempted to consolidate his rule with all the tools of courtcraft he had mastered. Alliances forged in whispered halls, decrees enforced by mercenaries, and promises sold, like silk to the discontented. Yet none of these held against the tide rising behind Khutulun. She was no longer just a general or a princess in exile. She was a symbol of resistance to an empire losing its soul. Her forces swelled with warriors, disillusioned by Horus's weak leadership and nobles tired of court intrigues that drained the treasury and bled the spirit. The people did not rally merely to a name. They rallied to the promise she embodied of an empire renewed through strength, honor, and unyielding will. Khutulun's strategy was both brutal and precise. She avoided open battles where the Yuan armies held advantage in numbers and siege engines. Instead, she struck swiftly raids that disrupted supply lines, ambushes in mountain passes, and hit-and-run attacks that kept her enemies off balance. Every skirmish was a lesson in psychological warfare, wearing down the resolve of Horus's supporters and inspiring her own. But beyond the battlefield, Khutulun understood the power of stories. She sent envoys to distant tribes, speaking not only of war, but of a future where women might rule not as anomalies, but as rightful heirs to the legacy of Genghis. Her charisma was undeniable, a mixture of fierce intellect, charisma, and an unwavering conviction that what she sought was not mere power, but justice for the empire's fractured soul. And as winter thawed into spring, the balance began to shift. Villages once silent now raised her banner. Clans that had pledged loyalty to Horus sent spies and messengers to her camp. The Mongol Empire, vast, ancient, and supposedly unbreakable, faced a reckoning not from outside invaders, but from within. A woman had dared to break its most sacred rules, and in doing so, she breathed new life into its dying heart. The spring winds carried more than the scent of thawing earth. They bore the sound of shifting loyalties and whispered betrayals. Khutulun's name spread beyond the borders of Kaidu's fractured realm, stirring hope in some, fear in others. An outright fury in the Yuan court, Kublai Khan, seated in his palace of marble and jade, was not a man to ignore such a challenge. The Mongol Empire was vast, but its greatest vulnerability lay in the fractured lines of blood and ambition that Khutulun now exploited. Intelligence reached the Yuan throne. A woman had raised an army, defied her brothers, and threatened to unravel the fragile peace they had imposed. Advisors counseled swift action to send armies, spies, or assassins. Kublai himself, with a mind sharpened by years of conquest and governance, chose a subtler path. He dispatched envoys with gifts and promises, seeking to entice Khutulun with honor and alliance, attempting to seduce her back into the fold not by force, but by the lure of legitimacy. But Khutulun, fierce and unyielding, understood the poison. Beneath the honeyed words, she refused to be bought or bargained with. To her, the Yuan court was a symbol of everything her father had fought against: corruption, decadence, and betrayal of the steppes' ancient spirit. The game had become more dangerous. Horus, weakened and desperate, saw his authority eroding like sand. He begged Kublai for reinforcements, promising submission if only he could crush Khutulun's uprising. The Yuan armies began their march westward, banners unfurling like thunderclouds over the grasslands. But Khutulun was no longer just a daughter of Kaidu. She was a commander whose name struck fear into even the most seasoned generals. She anticipated their moves, setting traps in the narrow passes, using the terrain as a weapon. Her troops, hardened by years of exile and battle, fought with a ferocity that seemed to summon the ghost of Genghis Khan himself. The battle for the Mongol Empire's future was no longer about lineage or title. It was about survival of an idea, a spirit, and a woman who dared to wield both with unwavering resolve. The clash of steel and thunder echoed across the valleys as Khutulun's forces met the Yuan legions, in a series of brutal encounters that would come to define her legacy. Each battle was a deadly dance, one where every arrow loosed and every charge executed was steeped in strategy, desperation, and raw will. She fought not for glory, but to preserve the freedom of her people and the honor of a legacy that many wished to see extinguished. Her tactics were a masterclass in asymmetric warfare, knowing the vast armies of Kublai could outmatch her in numbers and siege. She avoided pitched battles unless rain favored her. Instead, she waged a war of attrition, disrupting supply lines, striking at communication routes, and employing the speed and agility of the horsemen that had made Mongols feared across continents. But it was more than battlefield acumen that defined her. Khutulun's leadership forged an unbreakable bond between her and her warriors. She shared their hardships, sleeping beside them under the vast, indifferent sky, eating the same rations, and bearing the wounds of combat without complaint. Her presence was a beacon in the bleak expanse of war, a promise that no matter how fierce the storm, they would endure. This was a woman who had wrestled with giants and refused to bow, whose every victory was a testament not just to skill, but to the unyielding fire that burned in her heart. The Yuan commanders grew increasingly frustrated, their massive war machine churning against a nimble and relentless foe. Dispatches spoke of frustration and fear that the daughter of the steppe was more than a myth. Yet, Khutulun's struggle was not merely military. She grappled with the complex web of alliances that held the empire's fringes together. Some clans swore loyalty to her cause, others shifted allegiance with the wind, their decisions guided by survival rather than conviction. She negotiated with tribal leaders, offering protection, trade, and a vision of a Mongol realm restored to its primal strength, but one where a woman's rule was no longer an impossibility. It was a bold promise that challenged centuries of tradition. As the battles raged, so did the question haunting every corner of the empire. Could a woman truly break the Mongol Empire? And more terrifying still, could she hold it together? The winds of war swept across the steppe with relentless fury, but so did the currents of doubt and defiance within Khutulun's own ranks. For even as she fought external enemies, she faced the unspoken struggle of legitimacy among her followers, a challenge not of battlefields, but of beliefs etched into generations. Mongol society, steeped in traditions that bound leadership to male lineage, wrestled with the reality of a woman leading armies and governing territories with unmatched authority. Some of her closest allies whispered fears in shadows, questioning whether her reign could endure beyond her formidable presence. Yet Khutulun met this challenge with the same ferocity she brought to combat. She understood that breaking the empire was only half the battle. She had to break the chains of expectation that bound her people's minds. Her speeches were not just calls to arms, but manifestos of change. She invoked the spirit of Genghis Khan not as a patriarch, but as a visionary who valued strength and wisdom above gender or birthright. She reminded them that the steppe had always belonged to those who dared, not to those who followed. In councils and around campfires, her voice wove stories of the past and visions of the future, a Mongol Empire reborn, fierce and free, where merit trumped tradition and courage was the highest law. Yet even as she inspired, she faced betrayals that cut deep. Allies who once pledged their loyalty shifted with the winds of fortune. Swayed by promises of peace or power from the Yuan court, spies infiltrated her camps, their whispers seeping into the ears of those closest to her. And in the darkest moments, Khutulun wrestled not with enemies on the field, but with the fear that the empire might crumble beneath her grasp, that her defiance might be the spark that ignited its final collapse. The weight of legacy, rebellion, and survival pressed upon her like the vast, unyielding sky. But she refused to bend. For in the heart of every storm lies a choice, to break or to become the storm itself. As the seasons turned again, the Mongol Empire's fate hung in a delicate balance between destruction and rebirth. Khutulun's campaigns had not only challenged armies but had fractured the very foundation of power, forcing a reckoning with centuries-old norms. The Yuan court, alarmed by her unyielding resistance, escalated their efforts, sending elite assassins cloaked as traitors and diplomats to infiltrate her inner circle. Each betrayal stung like an arrow to the heart, but none broke her resolve. In one harrowing night, a trusted lieutenant turned, leading a Yuan force into her camp, an ambush that left scars etched in both flesh and spirit. Yet Khutulun survived, as always, emerging from the fire sharper and more determined. Her legend grew with every sacrifice, a living testament to resilience and a world determined to silence her. But beyond the battlefield, she faced a deeper, or one of identity and vision. She knew that ruling meant more than victories. It meant binding the empire's diverse peoples under a shared banner, a collective future that embraced change without betraying heritage. To that end, she summoned emissaries from distant tribes and former enemies alike, weaving alliances through marriage, trade, and mutual defense. She championed the ancient code of the steppe, yet infused it with a radical truth that strength was not confined to one gender, nor loyalty limited by birth. This radical vision unsettled many, but it also inspired a new generation of warriors and leaders who saw in Khutulun not just a commander, but a symbol of what the empire could become. Her story, told in whispers and songs, spread beyond the grasslands to distant cities and courts, challenging the world's understanding of power. Yet, even as she built this fragile coalition, the shadow of the Yuan army loomed larger. Horus, desperate and cornered, struck a fatal deal with Kublai Khan, promising submission in exchange for aid to crush Khutulun once and for all. The stage was set for a final confrontation, one that would decide not only who ruled the Mongol Empire, but what it would become in the annals of history. The vast steppes became the stage for a final reckoning that echoed with the weight of empires past and futures yet unwritten. Khutulun, now a figure both revered and reviled, marshaled every ounce of her strength, wisdom, and strategy for the inevitable clash with the combined forces of Horus and the Yuan. Her warriors, bound not just by blood, but by belief, stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the darkening skies, their hearts steeled against the storm to come. She knew that this battle would not merely decide a throne, but the very soul of the Mongol world, whether it would be shackled by old fears or reborn through courage and change. As the armies faced off, the air was thick with tension, silence. Hanging heavy like a shroud, Khutulun rode to the front, her eyes scanning the horizon with a mixture of fierce determination and somber resolve. The wind whispered promises of victory and warnings of sacrifice. The first clash shattered the stillness, the thunder of hooves and the clash of steel merging into a primal symphony of war. Khutulun led her riders with unmatched precision, striking at the enemy's flanks, disrupting formations with lightning-fast maneuvers. Each move was a calculated gamble, balancing risk and reward on her razor's edge. Yet even as the battle raged, her mind was alive with strategy beyond the immediate fight, sending riders to cut supply lines, coordinating ambushes, and sowing confusion in the enemy ranks. But war is a cruel master. The cost was high. Friends fell beside her, banners were torn, and the land itself seemed to weep under the blood-soaked hoofprints. Amid the chaos, Khutulun's voice rose, a clarion call that rallied her troops, reminding them of the stakes beyond the battle: honor, freedom, and the future of a fractured empire. As day gave way to twilight, it became clear that this war would not end in a single battle, but would shape the destiny of the Mongol people for generations. Khutulun, the woman who dared to break the empire, had become the storm that could neither be ignored nor easily quelled. As the dust settled on the battlefield, the landscape bore scars deeper than those carved by sword and spear. The Mongol Empire was no longer the monolith it had once been. It was fractured, vulnerable, and forever changed. Khutulun, battered but unbroken, surveyed the aftermath with eyes that saw beyond the carnage to the fragile hope lingering beneath. Her forces had triumphed, but victory was a double-edged sword. The price had been steep: thousands of warriors lost, villages razed, and trust strained to its breaking point. Yet, in the silence that followed, a new chapter began to emerge. Khutulun's leadership, forged in fire and tempered by hardship, had redefined what it meant to rule. No longer was power a birthright sealed by bloodlines alone. It was a mantle, earned through sacrifice, vision, and unyielding will. She moved swiftly to consolidate her gains, reaching out to clans and factions wary of continued conflict. Through diplomacy as sharp as her arrows, she brokered fragile alliances, weaving a tapestry of unity from threads frayed by war. But the path ahead was treacherous. The Yuan dynasty, though pushed back, remained a looming threat. Their ambition, undimmed by defeat, Horus, disgraced and desperate, fled to distant corners, plotting revenge and sowing discord. Khutulun understood that holding the empire required more than armies. It demanded a transformation of its very soul. She championed reforms, encouraging education, fostering trade, and elevating voices long silenced by tradition. In her vision, the Mongol Empire would not merely survive, it would evolve, embracing strength not just in conquest, but in resilience and justice. Yet, even as she laid these foundations, the question lingered like a shadow. Could the empire truly change? Or would the old ghosts of power and prejudice rise again to claim what she had fought so fiercely to build? For Khutulun, the battle was far from over. The empire she dared to break now depended on her to hold together what history itself seemed determined to unravel. Years passed like the relentless sweep of the steppe winds, carrying with them the echoes of Khutulun's reign, an era marked by both hope and haunting uncertainty. Her vision for a renewed Mongol Empire resonated deeply with many, yet the old order resisted with stubborn ferocity. The court, though transformed in appearance, still bore the scars of ancient rivalries and whispered betrayals. Khutulun ruled not from a gilded throne, but from a council tent pitched among her warriors, embodying a leadership that bridged the chasm between tradition and transformation. Her decrees championed merit over lineage, wisdom over entitlement. Yet every step forward was met with resistance from those clinging to power's familiar contours. The steppe was a land of extremes, its beauty matched only by its brutality. Khutulun knew that the empire's survival depended on balancing these forces. She invested in strengthening trade routes, not merely for wealth, but to weave disparate tribes into a shared destiny. Caravans laden with silk, spices, and ideas crossed her territories, carrying with them seeds of connection that might one day bloom into peace. Yet shadows lingered. The Yuan dynasty, though weakened, maintained pockets of influence and spies who undermined her rule. Ors, exiled but not defeated, fomented rebellion in distant provinces, exploiting the empire's fractures with promises of restoration and vengeance. Khutulun faced these threats not only with armies, but with diplomacy, intelligence, and an unwavering belief that the empire's strength lay in unity forged through respect and courage. But perhaps her greatest battle was internal, the quiet war against doubt and exhaustion that gnawed at even the fiercest hearts. She carried the weight of expectation, legacy, and sacrifice with a solemn grace. Yet beneath her stoic exterior lay the unspoken question: could one woman truly reshape the destiny of a vast, an ancient empire in the silence of the endless steppe nights as stars wheeled overhead? Khutulun wrestled with this question, knowing that history's judgment was patient and her story, like the empire itself, was still being written. The twilight of Khutulun's life unfolded against a backdrop of uneasy peace and simmering unrest. Her hair, once as dark as the endless night sky, now bore streaks of silver, a testament to the relentless passage of years spent in war, counsel, and unyielding resolve. The empire she fought to reshape bore the marks of her hand. New alliances forged across cultures, the elevation of meritocracy, and the lingering scent of revolution in the air. Yet, the shadows of the past never fully receded. Factions within the empire's heart continued to whisper, plotting the restoration of old hierarchies, fearful of a future shaped by a woman's vision. Khutulun, despite her legend, was mortal. Her body, worn from decades of battle and burden, demanded moments of rest that her spirit refused to grant. She spent long nights gazing at the stars, pondering the vast tapestry of history and her small, stubborn thread woven through it. Her legacy was contested, celebrated by some, reviled by others, but it was undeniable. She had shattered the empire's expectations, forcing it to confront the possibility of change in its most sacred institutions. As her final years approached, Khutulun turned her attention to the future, to the children and leaders who would inherit the fractured realm. She sought to instill in them the lessons hard-earned through blood and fire. That strength was not the sole domain of men. The courage was often quiet and steadfast, and that the survival of an empire depended on its willingness to adapt and embrace the unknown. Her passing, when it came, was as serene as the steppe dawn, a quiet departure that left behind a world irrevocably altered. Stories of the woman who dared to break the Mongol Empire would ripple through generations, a beacon to those who dared to defy convention and shape history with their own hands. But her final question, whispered in the wind and etched in the hearts of her people, remained. Could the empire she fought for survive the very revolution she ignited? The years following Khutulun's death were a crucible of transformation and turmoil, the empire forever marked by the ripples of her defiance, her vision. Like an ember glowing beneath ash, ignited both hope and fear across the vast territories. Some saw her as a martyr, the fierce lioness who had dared to stand where none had before, a symbol of strength that transcended gender and bloodline. Others branded her a rebel, a disruptor who fractured the unity of the Mongol peoples at their most vulnerable hour. Her reforms endured in pockets. New leaders rose, inspired by her meritocratic ideals, challenging the old aristocracy. Trade flourished along the routes she had secured, weaving distant tribes and cultures into fragile alliances that hinted at a future of possibility. Yet, the ghosts of the past haunted the empire's corridors. The Yuan dynasty, though pushed to the edges, maintained its ambition, waiting patiently for cracks to widen. Horus's descendants, embittered and vengeful, plotted in shadows, seeking to reclaim the throne through blood and betrayal. And within the empire itself, old prejudices and fears simmer beneath the surface, threatening to unravel the fragile tapestry Khutulun had woven. Her legacy was a paradox, a force of change that inspired and unsettled, a hero and a warning. The empire she dared to break was no longer whole, yet it was not yet lost. It existed in a delicate balance of world, suspended between the memory of past glories and the uncertain promise of a new dawn. In whispered tales around campfires and in the halls of power, her name endured a reminder that history is shaped not only by those who inherit power, but by those brave enough to seize it. And so the Mongol Empire moved forward, forever altered by the woman who dared to break it. In the quiet moments when the fires dim and the endless steppe stretches beneath a tapestry of stars, the story of Khutulun lingers, a testament to power, sacrifice, and the indomitable will to change destiny. She was more than a warrior or a princess. She was a force that shattered the brittle conventions of her world, daring to stand as both daughter and breaker of an empire. Her life was a fierce symphony of loyalty and rebellion, love and loss. Triumph and exile, a reflection of the Mongol Empire itself, caught between its glorious past and an uncertain future. The empire's vastness was both its strength and its curse, a land too wild, too vast, and too divided to be easily tamed. Khutulun's legacy is a reminder that true leadership transcends bloodlines and tradition, that courage often lives in defiance, and that the future belongs to those who dare to reshape the world even when the odds seem insurmountable. Yet, her story closes not with certainty, but with an unresolved question, one that haunts history's pages and challenges us still. Can the spirit of an empire survive the woman who dared to break it? This is Candle and Coffin. Let's uncover the forgotten truth beneath the ashes of history. If this story moved you, subscribe for more untold histories that shaped our world.